Okay, thank you. Welcome to everyone to our October Women Alone Together book program. We've all been anticipating this event, and I'm sorry we're not in person. We had tried to do this in person, and you could sign up either for Zoom or to come in person, and our Zoom signups were much greater. So it indicated to me that some of you were still reluctant to come out. But nonetheless, we have a great program, and I think you're really going to enjoy today. Um, First, before I introduce Anne, I just have a few announcements. I want you to go on chat and give your questions while Anne is talking. And then I will try to ask your questions after we've had our conversation. And I already have some from you, but we will work in as many as we can. I also wanted to ask that if you will send me an email and tell me any books that you would like to consider for the spring. We always like to have input from our members. And of course, it will depend on which speakers we can line up. We like to get authors if we can, and sometimes professors if we can't get authors. But please send me your suggestions and also respond to our 4 o'clock time. We're doing 4 o'clock because we were fighting traffic for about 15 years at 6 o'clock and decided that it was very difficult to meet at that time. But this is a new time at 4 o'clock where we'll have our programs from 4 to 5 or 5:30. And then if we're in person, we can have our refreshments, a light buffet after that. And that is our format that we want to follow, whether we're on Zoom or in person. And I want to remind you that we used to do a classic each year. Please, in your email to me, tell me if you want to do a classic this year. That's always fun. And if you go back, you can go on our website and look back at past things we've done for years. We always did, a Dickens or Jane Austen or something like that. We may go back to that in the spring too. But in November, I'm reminding you that we're very excited. We're going to have Lisa Wingate to talk about her book, Before We Were Yours. And we're partnering with the Agnes Scott Alumni Association and co-sponsoring this appearance. And I'm very excited about that. So you may have read it several years ago, but if you did, read it again, because I just read it a couple of weeks ago and I enjoyed it thoroughly and saw new things that I had missed the first time, and I was reminded. I also just read Lisa's new book, The Book of Lost Friends. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And we will also be referring to Before and After, the nonfiction book that Lisa Wingate wrote with Julie Christie, examining Georgia Tann and the orphanage in Tennessee that is central to this book, Before We Were Yours, where they actually stole children and then sold them. It was just horrible. But in the end, her book, Before We Were Yours, is ultimately a story of survival and of strong women, which is a favorite theme of all of us every year. Okay, I want to introduce my friend Anne Hite now. Anne is known to many of you, I'm sure. She has written 6 novels in her Black Mountain series. When I asked Anne to appear, I asked her to select the book that she wanted to present, and she selected Where the Souls Go. And it actually was written later, but in chronological order, it is the first. But Anne is so busy and so talented. She has written a memoir that came out last year and was a finalist. Was up against Memorial Drive of Natasha Trethewey, which was high cotton, but wonderful achievement for her. She's got a book coming out in a month, Going to the Water. And then she has got another book, Hates on Black Mountain, coming out next fall. So she is a busy woman. In 2012, she won Georgia Writer of the Year. She was a finalist for the Townsend Award, which is the award that Georgia gives to the most outstanding fiction writer every 2 years. So, and she was also president of the Georgia Writers Association. So she has done so much writing, and she's such an accomplished author. We are delighted that she's here with us today. But I want to add a personal note. Some of you know that I have written a book, and when I sent it to my publisher the first time, he said, "You got a story here, but you're writing it like a historian with your nonfiction brain." And he said, "You've got to write with imagination and be more of a fiction writer, and you've got to learn how to do that." And Ann Hite was recommended, so I called her and lined her up, and she has read the text of my new book, and she became my editor. And we would talk about every week or 2 weeks, and she would make suggestions. It was like having homework assignments, but it was wonderful. And she became my teacher. So now Ann is my teacher and my friend and a very accomplished writer. And we're delighted to have her with us here today. Okay, Ann, you may respond.
Gosh, you made me sound so good. and Carolyn's book is wonderful. I can't wait for you guys to read it. But I'm glad to be here. I'm excited.
Well, thank you. And what we want to do today is more or less an interview format, but Ann is free to say anything at any time that she wants to say. She's done this many times. She's the expert here. But I thought I would start out by telling us how you started writing, when you started writing, and maybe what was your inspiration?
Well, I started writing when I was a kid. I mean, I started before I could even write. I would tell stories. So I'd go out in the backyard and I'd tell I had this place that I walked up and down by the ditch in my grandmother's yard, and I'd walk up and down the ditch and tell stories out loud. And I think they kind of worried about me doing that, but it was just one of those things. And then I would listen to everybody's stories. My grandmother would take me up into Appalachia with my great aunts, and that was like a whole nother world. You know, we lived down in Marietta, and she was a Rosie the Riveter. And then when she lost her job, when all the men came back, she went to work for Riches, and she was a richest girl. And so, you know, everything was very proper and that kind of thing. And we'd go to Appalachia to visit my aunts, and you know, that was a different world. My grandmother became somebody I didn't know too. I mean, you know, she would speak almost a different language because it would, you know, she never used slang at home. She worked very hard to have an education and move up, because she was a single mom and then a single woman. So, you know, it was interesting. And I would sit in the room. My cousins would go out to play, and I would sit in the room, and they'd forget I was there because I'd be really quiet, you know, and they'd start telling the real stories. So a lot of my ghost stories were heavily influenced from listening to them talk. And then I would write ghost stories and make my brother, who was 7 years younger than me and was terrified of everything, and I was never afraid of much of anything, and I would read the ghost stories to him out on the back, what we called the back stoop. And he would go and tell my mother and be terrified. He'd be afraid to walk through the room in the dark. And, you know, so it was kind of interesting. He's still that way. He doesn't read much of my work. So, and my work's not that scary to me. I don't think it is, but, you know, so that's how I became, you know, it's just something I always wanted to do. It just seemed natural. I come from a storytelling family, and then just putting them into words seemed natural. This particular book was influenced by my mother and my grandmother and me, and that relationship that takes place between a mother and a grandmother and the daughter, you know, that triangle. I almost see it as a triangle. And so it was heavily influenced by that.
Well, in all families, the mother-daughter relationship is complex, and mother, grandmother. And you said you actually started writing when your grandmother died, and
yes,
telling her stories. I mean, officially.
When my mother died.
Your mother.
I was writing secretly. I worked for BP Oil, and I was a technical writer for BP Oil, but I started writing fiction secretly, you know, just for me, because I didn't want to tell anybody about it. And that way, if it sucked, it was okay. And I would just kind of fool around with it, but I never showed it to anybody. And then my mother died. And when she did, she was the last. My father had already died. My grandmother had died 10 years almost to the day before my mother. And then my mother died. And it just, threw me for a loop, because, you start to think, okay, there's nobody left that I can go and say, or blame for, any of my weird stuff or any of that kind of thing. And I took 2 weeks off from work and wrote 10 short stories in 2 weeks, which is unheard of for me because I don't usually do that. And I sent them all out before, I had a chance to decide not to do that, to back out of it. So I sent them all out to journals. And to my surprise, I started getting, all of them were accepted within 2 months. They had all been accepted. I didn't get a rejection on any of them, which just blew my mind. But I think too, part of that was they were all building up inside of me. And I do believe a lot writers write a lot in their head before they put it on paper. And I think I'd been writing those stories for quite a while. And when Mother died, then it felt like I could tell the stories I wanted to tell without hurting anybody. So they just started pouring out.
That's fascinating. And obviously, you're a great storyteller, by the way. I mean, I think you're a great storyteller. But to have no rejections the first time you sent anything in, that is just...
I got plenty of rejections after those first 10, but those first 10, those first 10 was accepted immediately. After that, I was just totally insulted the first time I was rejected, How
could they reject anything I've done?
Right.
Well, I think that's very interesting. I know that when my grandmother died, one of my grandmothers died. I was in California and I had to fly back on an airplane. I was by myself. My husband was not with me on that trip. And I just started writing, and it just was, like you say, pouring out of me. Now, I've never done anything with that, but maybe I should go back and look at it. But it's a way of remembering people, and it's a way of examining your relationships and their life, and it's very therapeutic. And
for me, I had just, right before my mother died, I had seen the Joy Luck Club for the first time. I had seen the movie, and it was an older movie. It wasn't new, but it was just the first time I had seen it. And I had read an essay by Amy Tan about how she took the truths of her family, but also just decided to make them the story she wanted to make them. And that felt so freeing. So one of the stories in the 10 stories that were accepted was called Borrowed Time. And it was I decided, I can make this the way I want to. It actually became part of Where the Souls Go. And I could make it the way I want to. I can make my grandmother react the way I wanted her to, that I think she could have reacted if she wanted to, or, if society had let her. I can do anything I want to do. And that felt very freeing, and it just kind of poured out, it was like, so a lot of it was reimagining what could have happened, instead of what did happen.
Well, that's a wonderful concept. And I do think the imagination, that's what's been so exciting to me about writing fiction for the first time, is that you can use your imagination and you can change things. And it's really was fun to me, really a lot of fun, a lot of work, but a lot of fun at the same time. And I want you to comment on, your book is woven around sewing and stitching and patterns. And I thought that was very interesting. You name parts of your book, basting, stitching, and all of that. Comment on that.
Well, my grandmother and my mother were both seamstress. My grandmother did all the handwork. So she would do my daughters. I have 4 daughters, and the first 2 had the most beautiful dresses you've ever seen. And she would hand smock them, and she would make the little lace that goes around the collars. She would, I think it's tatting. She would do that. And she would do these hems that were just absolutely amazing. And just all the little handwork. My mother could look at you and say, okay, I know what dress you need. And she wouldn't necessarily even use a pattern. She would just work on it. It was like a piece of art for her, but she never saw it that way. But, you know, I realize now thinking back, she was just meant to do that, but she was born so early in you know, that doesn't, it just didn't happen, you know, wasn't in her, in the stars. Had she been born 20 years later than she would have very easily fit into New York fashion and probably been a much happier woman, because she just loved that. She could make men's suits. She could, you know, she did all of that. And I did none of it. I hated sewing. I know a lot about it because I was taught to do it, but I hated it. I despised it. I did not follow in their footsteps, but it was a real art to them, you know, and they had real hard scrabbled lives. And this was, I think it was their outlet, especially my mom. I think it was her outlet. It was her way of saying, this is mine. This is what I'm doing now is mine. This is mine. You know, I'm not sure she ever viewed it as art, but she saw it as something that she could do that other people couldn't do.
I really do think it was an art, and we are losing that now.
Oh, yeah.
I remember my grandmother sewing and my mother sewing, and they did beautiful things. And when I was going to school as a young girl, I had homemade dresses. Oh, my dresses are homemade, you know, and I thought they weren't as good as the store-bought dresses, but they were really probably much prettier and finer made than dresses. And I will tell everybody, my mother made my wedding gown and gave pearls and lace. And it was really beautiful. And I had two cousins that also wore that wedding dress, and I have it still. It's really a family treasure. And my mother also was a quilter. And we had some of her quilts, and the women used to gather and quilt together. It was social for them. It was community.
Oh, yeah. And for, well, you know, I have a quilt of my grandmother's, but with my mom, yeah, it was just, she would make the most beautiful clothes for me. And this is in the mid 70s when I was a teenager, and all I wanted was to go to Panamine and buy a $5 pair of jeans. That's what I wanted. That's how I wanted to look. But she would make, and my friends at school would just say, oh, you're so lucky, because she would make me she made me a purple suede skirt with a purple blouse, and then she went and bought purple tights, the exact same color as the, you know, as the clothes. And then she bought purple shoes, these little shoes. And everybody was like, oh, I love that. I love it. And I think, oh, all I want is a pair of jeans, you know? And I couldn't even get, and now I look back and realize that was her way of doing something beautiful for me, you know, but I was a stupid teenager and didn't get it. My grandmother worked at Rich's. So if I didn't get homemade stuff, I got clothes from Rich's, and I didn't want clothes from Rich's. I wanted them from the secondhand store. You know, it was that time in life, or I wanted, you know, an old sweatshirt and a pair of raggedy jeans, you know, but anyway.
Well, we'll have to talk sometimes, because Bill's father worked at Rich's and my mother worked at Rich's at one time. I bet they knew each other.
They probably did, because my grandmother went to work in 1946. She went to work for Rich's, and she worked for Rich's through 72 or 73. I can't remember. Might have been even a little later. It might have been 76, but I don't remember. But she, you know, she was there. She worked downtown until they built the Cobb Center Rich's. And that was just very close to where she lived. And so she asked for a transfer so she wouldn't have to drive downtown every day.
Well, we'll have to explore that sometime. I think that's very interesting. Now, you said you visited Black Mountain as a child. I remember visiting Black Mountain. They would have, you know, church conferences, and there was some big
Methodist
building up on a hill. And I remember that Bill had an FCA thing there one time, and I went with him. And so I know that Black Mountain is real. You didn't make it up.
No.
And it is a location. And we lived in the mountains of North Carolina. We had a cabin up there for 20 years. And there was something about the mountain people were distrustful of outsiders.
Hmm.
And, they did have their beliefs and their stories, and you could tell that you
In
were.
their own language. In their
Yeah,
own language, really. I mean, they did and they didn't, but they would say things that I'd have to ask my grandmother later, what did that word mean? Like poke. Poke is a bag.
yeah.
But I'd hear one of them say, go, my aunt told me, go in the kitchen in there and get that poke off the table. And I thought, oh God, what is a poke? And, but I didn't want to I was very shy too. And I went into the kitchen, all that was on the table was a bag. So I thought, okay, that must be what a poke is. So,
You learn by doing, learn from it. Yeah,
this is so true.
well, there's so much to talk about in this book, and it's so complex because it goes through generations. And
Yeah.
I was talking with Anne a little bit earlier, and it occurred to me that the story of Pearl, and when Robert Todd appears and she's working in the garden, and she's only 15 years old, and she's so innocent, and she tries not to be attracted to him, but she just couldn't help herself. And then that whole episode was so dramatic with the pregnancy and all that, and the baby and the black leopard that ended up being a black woman. I saw every element of what you're writing about. I said that could be a short story because it's all there. And would you just talk a little bit about that? Did you sort of write your book in segments or parts that could all stand alone?
This book actually was dead in the water, and I was ready to throw it out. And I think I've told you about this, and then this is significant, and this is how it became in the segments. It was the most boring book. You would not want to read it. And, I mean, it was horrible, and it wasn't in the structure that it's in now. And I was just thinking it's worthless. And I was doing edits for the last edits on my second book, The Story Catcher, and my daughter at that time was 40. My oldest daughter was turning 40. She's 38, 39. And all of a sudden she was really interested in, family trees and what happened. And, and she said, I'm researching it. And I said, that's fine, but don't bother me because I've got to do these edits. So I can't get into that right now. And I got an email one day right after that said, I found a sister of Granny's that you didn't know about. And that blew my mind because my grandmother told me so much, much more than most grandmothers would tell their granddaughters. And so I couldn't imagine her keeping a secret like that, a sister that died when she was 9 in the house with her. And she had told me about death, so it wasn't like she didn't want to talk about death, and I never could figure it out, but I was really haunted and her name was Mary Alice. And I was really haunted, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna give her story. And I realized, let's add her to Where the Souls Go. So the first part of the book opens up with Mary Grace, and she's married. She's of course named Mary Grace for other reasons, but I kept Mary. And it's opened up, and that's when the book just kind of bloomed. And I realized to write, if I started in chronological order, then what would happen is it wouldn't have any ending. If I had to write backwards. I could not start from the beginning because the actual climax of the book is the very first in chronological order. It's almost the first. So I said, oh, wow, this is different. I've got to do something different with this. And I decided at that point about the sewing. And that's how the sections became. They could almost stand alone because I would just decide, okay, I'm going to write about, this is how I'm going to structure the book. I'm going to take how you would go through to make a dress. And I'll start with the very basics and go all the way to the end of making that dress. And I'll tell the story that way, and I'll tell it backwards. I'll tell it from the beginning or the present time at that time, which was Annie Todd in 1963. And I'll work my way back,
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I did.
Wow.
And
It's complex. And sometimes I would find myself, looking back and forth and saying, now, what year is this? And who is this?
yeah,
But you do a good job of, and you helped me with my book, ending up dividing it into parts and identifying, whose chapter that is or whose section that is. But I tell you what, when you talk about the first line of a book, I would say that I died when I was 10, just 10. I thought I'd live to be an old woman and do things that old women do, cook for a gaggle of family, sew quilts and sit in a chair watching the kids play. I had me some dreams, but instead I ended up hidden, tucked away, a secret. How's that for a beginning of a book?
thank you. I worked on that a long time. And actually, parts of this book had been around for a while, but Mary Grace was the newer parts.
Mhm.
And I finally found the voice, because I couldn't find the voice of the book until Mary Grace comes along.
Mhm.
And then she kind of ties all the pieces together,
Mhm.
and that's the first thing she said to me. She just, I hear my characters, like, and that was the first thing that came out. And of course, I wrote it down. I forget where I was at, but it was somewhere. I wrote it down. I said, okay, maybe this book's going to get saved, So,
I do think your characters, I mean, I haven't done but one novel, but I think your characters do take on a personality, and you do talk
yes,
about them, and they do say things. And I've heard a lot of authors talk about how their characters take on life and talk to them, and they can't put them to sleep. I mean, they just stay with them always. And and you came back over and over to Black Mountain. I mean, you keep
oh
talking.
yeah.
I
and
haven't read all of your other books, but I
and
do.
this book, while it wasn't written, wasn't written until after Ghost on Black Mountain and The Story Catcher and Low Country Spirit. It returns to Ghost on Black Mountain, because when I wrote Ghost on Black Mountain, I really couldn't know a lot about Hobbs Pritchett, because he had to be this mean man, and there couldn't be any sympathy showed towards him whatsoever. And so I couldn't really know who he was other than who he was in that book. And this book went back and kind of investigated what makes people turn out like that, and he definitely stays a bad guy in here, but you at least know why.
Well,
why
you
he was a bad guy.
really helped me with that when I was writing my book. And characters are not all good or all bad.
Right.
And
They're just flawed.
usually they're flawed, and something made them the way they are. And when you work that into your novel, they become much more complex and much more interesting to the reader, I think.
Exactly. Because we identify, because we're all flawed, as much as we would like to think we're not. We are all flawed, and we can identify with even the worst character, which will make us hate them, because there's a part of them that we recognize, not necessarily in ourselves, but in something that's happened to us, or who we've been around, and that kind of thing. So
well, you can describe things, and you're so vivid in your description that yes, you can identify. And I found myself thinking sometimes, like when Pearl's getting fascinated with Robert Todd, I'm saying, oh no, don't do that. I mean, I'm seeing and feeling, oh dear, this girl's going to get in trouble. But
and that, and even when I'm writing it, sometimes I'll say, okay, I'm not having her do that, or I'm not having him do that, and I'll try to go in another direction, and the book, the story just comes to a halt, and it's just drivel. It's horrible. Because I won't let them go in the direction, and then I go back and give up and just say, okay, let's go. Where are you going? We're just going to see what happens. Well, so I do try to save them.
You try to give them a chance to save themselves. Yeah. But well, now you touched on this a little bit, but talk about, do you outline your books?
No, I can't, and I don't suggest it to anybody. I mean, because it's hard for me. It's I'm a pantser, from the seat of my pants. For me, what's exciting about a book is when I come to write it every day, and I'm going to find out what they do next.
Uh-huh. I
you
feel
know.
the same way you do, and I agree with you. But I read yesterday, the man that wrote The Gentleman from Moscow,
Yes,
uh,
yes.
and it was an article in Time magazine, and he talked about how he does a very precise outline of his.
And some people work really good like that. They do,
Uh,
because what they do is they can allow themselves, I think, from friends that I have that outline, they can allow themselves to think outside the outline. If I make an outline, it's a map and I got to stay with it, because you see
it
what
has too
I
much.
won't allow myself to go outside the parameters of it. So I have to do it by the seat of my pants so that all this stuff can happen,
Mhm.
because I won't allow it to happen. If it's not on that outline, then I won't allow it. I mean,
Yeah, I
that's just
can
how
see
I
how
am.
it would be restrictive. Um,
Right.
Now, I was as Lee. Is that a family name?
It's Asley is actually my great grandmother,
Oh, so
but
that's the family name.
the way that they spelt it was different. But what I decided to do was spell it phonically for the reader so they'd know how to pronounce it, which was Aslee. The way she spelt it was Aslee. So that, it
Oh,
was a
I
little bit
see.
different. And but I thought, let's do it where the reader can understand it's Aslee. But yeah, it is a family name. It's my great grandmother, and my great grandmother really was pushed from the car by my great grandfather.
Well,
A lot of that in there is real. So
wow, that she was a fascinating character, and all your theme of strong women is very apparent, and that's a theme with me too.
mm,
That
it's always been, I've always have strong women,
um,
you know,
well,
even my ghosts will be strong sometimes.
and one of our members, Cheryl Hall, said, "What inspired you to write about ghosts?" I mean, not many people write about ghosts or leave ghosts in their books, and yours is very real and very prominent.
I had um I did a book club at Foxtails for Ghosts on Black Mountain, and one of the readers, and you always get surprised with what a reader gets from it. And she said, your ghosts are metaphors for the emotions in the book. And I thought, oh, I like that. I didn't know it, but I like that. But honestly, ghosts, I've always been fascinated with it, because the Appalachian part of my family believed in ghosts. They just, to them, it was just part of everyday life, just like, going to the store and getting, you know, getting some butter or whatever. They just believe that ghosts exist, not in the sense of horror like we've taken ghost stories, but these were just stories they told. And give you an example. My great uncle, and you're going to love this name, and until I did Roll the Stone Away, I didn't even know what his real name was, but he was called Dugan. So my uncle Dugan, my great uncle Dugan, when he died, he was reported that my aunt and great aunt Stella, which is how you would pronounce it, but they pronounced it Stellar. So my great aunt Stellar would see him every night sitting in the chair out on the front porch where he sat when he came in from work. She would see him sitting there. She'd look out the window, and there he'd be sitting in the chair looking out on it was that kind of thing. And it always, intrigued me as a kid, because I didn't live in and live with my grandmother till I was 10, because my dad was in the Air Force, and I was an Air Force brat, moved all over and lived in Europe for a long time. And so this was like a whole nother country to come back to the South, and come back to my Appalachian family. So, it intrigued me to find out that there was adults that believed in ghosts, because I'd always heard, oh no, there's no such thing as ghosts. And then they just accepted them like it was just every day. So it always was fun to me to write about ghosts. Do I want to go out hunting ghosts? No, I don't think so. But it's fun to write about them. It's fun to write about them.
Well, and your characters would say, "I saw the ghost on the edge of the woods," or "she appeared at the foot of my bed," and that would seem frightening. um, it seems like, but none of the people seem particularly frightened by it in the book.
Right.
So
And that's because for them, something that they've just been raised that, oh, hey, this is what happens. Ghosts are whole. I think in the story catcher, the main character in the story, one of the main characters, the protagonist, Shelley, she says, I'm a whole lot more afraid of real people. That's the ones you got to worry about. The ghosts won't hurt you, and I love that because I think it sums it up with what their mentality was. Hey, they had a lot more going on than ghosts. Ghosts wasn't a big deal. Mm-hmm. So, it was an unusual thing.
Well, and like I say, we've talked about a little bit about your selection of names. I'm fascinated by names, and you brought something up to me when you read my book. You talked about one of my characters is Elijah, and you said that's a biblical name, and somebody else is called JJ. Says he doesn't even have a name, but and in the South we use double names. Or Annie Todd was called Annie Todd by her last name,
right?
Even though she was a little girl, and those names just come to you, I guess.
Yeah, Annie was a name that my grandmother called me. Mm-hmm. That instead of Anne, my name was Anne, but she would call me Annie, and she was the only one that ever called me Annie. And so I decided, okay, I'll name this character. When I realized I was kind of basing them on the three of us, I would call her Annie. My Aslee, of course, was named after my great grandmother, which was my grandmother's mother. Mm-hmm. And then Grace Jean was just kind of a play on Jeanette, which was my mother's mm-hmm. name. The Jean part and the Grace part kind of fit together. And so I called her that. Pearl. Okay, so Grace Jean, and I realized this, and we talked about this, I realized that I kind of split my grandmother down the middle and my mother down the middle, that they're aspects of themselves. My mother could be very much like Grace Jean. That's who she was most of the time. The things that you see, like making her daughter drive at the age that she was, those were the things that my mother would do. And then but she had that side of her, which I named Pearl. And I didn't do this on purpose. It just happened that way, that was named Pearl. And that was another side of my mother. That was a different side of my mother. That was the darker side of my mom. Mm-hmm. And then Aslee, of course, was my grandmother, and the one that most people saw all the time. And then Grandmother Todd was the grandmother that I knew all the time, and that looked out after me. And so I had her. I thought it was really funny because I didn't do that on purpose. And when I went back and read it in edits and stuff, I thought, wow, I did that. I separate the two because I saw her totally different from what other people saw her as very reserved, like Aslee was, and secretive, and putting men before a man before, and all of that was true. Mm-hmm. But I knew her as Grandmother Todd, that person that protects you.
Are you going to write about Black Mountain anymore?
I have one more book, and I'm going to write about Monteagle. So, okay. The granny woman, because I've had so many requests from readers they want just a little bit more Monteagle. So I think the last book is going to be about Maud.
Based on somebody in the mountains that you knew, or did you create her?
I just created her. Uh-huh. I think part of her is, of course, all of the characters, parts of the characters are me, but part of her is really me because she struggles with, Monteagle struggles with the science and the logical, and then the paranormal part. She really struggles with that. She doesn't believe in the paranormal part so much. People ask me, "Oh, I bet you've seen lots of ghosts. I bet you." And I said, I've always, the things that I've saw that's unusual, and I don't like to call them ghosts because I'm not sure I even believe in ghosts. I just think there's some kind of science behind it. And so I struggle with it like Maud does. And so, so I think Monteagle will be the last. She's such a wise, strong woman.
Oh, well, I look forward to reading about Maud because she was a wise woman. And you told me that writing your memoir was the hardest writing you've done.
Yeah, the book that's about to come out is the first fiction I've written since 2016, and when Sleeping Above Chaos came out, because most of that time was taken up writing Roll the Stone Away, which was the toughest, because you're writing something personal, and I walked away from it 2 or 3 times, because I thought, I'm not going to tell the story. I mean, the truth is almost always harder to write than fiction is, because I can hide in fiction. I can hide from it myself. The first part of Roll the Stone Away, I wrote 30,000 words in 3 weeks of it, and then got deathly ill. And I was working with, had talked with and done a lot with Jessica Handler. And she's a memoirist, and she writes about how to write tough things. And she said, oh my God, you wrote that much in 3, you're going to have to take it slower. It will make you physically ill. You're going to have to go slower. And so, and then I think, okay, I'm kind of doing okay with it. And then I'd find out something else that got left out of all the family stories, and it was just really tough. And there was some things like my great grandfather who pushed my great grandmother out of the car. And I didn't know that until I started really researching that book, that he actually did that. And he was also he was one of the night riders in Cumming in Forsyth County, who made all the African Americans leave or run them out of the county. He was part of that, which really just devastated me. I thought, how can I write about this? How can I tell people about this? And he must be rolling over in his grave, because we're so diverse. Our family's so diverse now. he must be going, oh, because it's just, it's amazing. And that was what was pointed out to me, was that I had to write about it, because it's proof. I knew nothing. My grandmother never talked about him, and the other to say that he was mean. That's all she talked about him. And she said, you knew nothing about him, and you broke the cycle, because it had gone through generation and generation and generation. And then, it broke with me. So it's not in the genes, not necessarily. It is about what, how you're raised, and what you believe. So, it's interesting.
People can really tell the truth about themselves or their family. And it is very painful. And sometimes your family gets upset about it. Did any of your family get upset when you wrote this?
No, because most of them are dead. And except my brother. And I explained to him I was going to write it before I did. And I explained to him that I would include some of the stuff about him. And he knew that I was going to do it anyway. But I would have gone ahead and done it. But I did want to talk to him about it ahead of time. And he was fine. He said, I won't read it because I lived it. But I think, he said, I think it's a story that has to be told, because I think it will help somebody that's gone through similar circumstances, and he said, I think it's just important that you do it, which was very freeing for me,
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think everyone can tell that we could just go on and on and on, but before we wrap up, I want Anne to tell you about what she is working on now. I just don't know what this woman's going to do next, but so fascinating. Tell us about your next project.
Oh, well, I'm working on it now. I spent the whole week in the years 1913 through 1915. I'm writing a nonfiction. Carol and I have kind of switched places. She wrote fiction, and I'm writing nonfiction. So I can sympathize with how hard it is. It's definitely hard. I have to think about, okay, am I telling the truth here? Or, because part of me wants to make it up. Oh, hey, this is probably what happened, and I can't really do that without saying, well, this probably is what happened. But I'm writing about Lucille Seeley Frank, which is Leo Frank's wife. And I was introduced to Leo Frank's story through my grandmother, who, long story short, and that's in Roll the Stone Away if you want to read about it, but she was taken as a 6-year-old child to see him hanging from the tree after he had been hung. They opened it up and let everybody go that wanted to come in and see him, and she saw him. And so she would tell the story, and some of her other stories would change when she'd tell it, but this story would never change. It would stay exactly the same. And when El Monzo man came forward and said, this is what I saw, and it wasn't, Leo Frank did not kill Mary Fagan, and I'm 86 years old and I don't want to die with not having told this. She got very angry. And I was with her that day when we were watching the news, and she said, that old man, and she was about almost his age, not quite yet. She said, that old man needs to shut up and leave it alone, because it doesn't matter anymore. And he doesn't need to stir up. And it was amazing to me that she had that reaction to it. Because, see, I had no idea at the time that she had gone in to see him, Leo Frank, hanging. The way that she would tell the story, she'd leave that part out. It was later that I discovered that she had actually witnessed Leo Frank. And so, yeah, it was. And so I started doing research like later, and just researching it for fun. I had no intentions of ever writing it. I was just researching it to know about it. And I had decided in 2013 or so that I was going to write a historical novel about Lucille and Leo. So I really started researching it. Mark was at Mercer was really interested in it. And as I researched Lucille, I was just blown away, because she was one of the strongest women, and we don't know anything about her. When you hear Leo Frank, you think Mary, or you hear Mary Fagan, you just think about the trial and the murder. Nobody knows what role she played in it. She was 24, 25, and she was such a strong woman, to be so young and to do the things that she did to help her husband and try to dispel because they would say, oh, she's going to divorce him. That was one of the rumors that the prosecution had put out there. And she went into the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, at the time were two different. She went and actually wrote letters to them saying, no, that is not the case. I do not believe that, and addressed it. Mm-hmm. And so there's, she's an amazing woman. And when she died, and this is, you can read a lot of this in other stuff that people have written, but when she died, it was 1957. She was in her 70s. His lynching took place in 1915, and her nephews, she wanted to be cremated, which was not what normally she would have happened. She was Jewish too. She came from a Jewish family that helped create Atlanta, like many Jewish families did. And she didn't want to be buried. She wanted to be sprinkled in Grant Park, because that's where her and Leo had some of the best times. And Grant Park back then was amazing place. It's not what we know now. And not that it isn't now, but it was just huge, and acres and a lake, and it was just really a cool place. And the city said, no, that's against the law. You can't sprinkle ashes there. So they carried her ashes around in the trunk of their car for forever, because they were afraid to bury her and put any kind of, headstone, because there was still that attitude. Today, there's still, I get lots of negative comments. There's still a lot of controversy. There's a division. There's the people that believe that he did it, and there's the people that believe he didn't do it. That's not why I'm writing the book. I'm writing the book about her, but she was carried around in the car. Mm-hmm. And finally, one early in the morning, her nephew went into Oakland and buried her ashes in between her mother and father without a headstone.
Wow. That is going to be a fascinating book, and it's a story that needs to be told. And I really look forward to you're completing that. Before we leave, we have a couple of questions and I want to make sure we get to them. One says, Ann, I loved Where the Souls Go and have started reading the series. Just watching Ghost of Black Mountain. 2 questions. Will I see Annie Todd again in book 5? You have inspired me to make a trip to Black Mountain next week. Are there any places of interest you recommend I visit?
Well, you'll probably see some of the things. A lot of them are just me, you know, going up the mountain and that kind of thing. That's my imagination, you know, that one particular mountain. Black Mountain is the village at the bottom of the Black Mountains. Okay. But you'll see some of the things like, and I'm going to say it wrong because I always pronounce Swananona, but I'm not pronouncing that right. You'll see the river, the Swananona River that weaves through there. That's a big part in her, you know, in that part of the book. Everything, the train, I go to the train depot because that's a part in the book and in the books. And I'd love to hear some more from Annie Todd because I think she still has a story to tell. So that's interesting that you bring up Annie Todd because I think that might be fun to do. So,
and, well, anyway, one little question you can just comment on was I thought telling the story in reverse, present to the last minute, was very effective. How and why did you decide to do that approach? Maybe you've already touched on that.
Yeah, it just was the only way to tell it.
Yeah.
But it took a long time to discover how to tell it.
Yeah.
You know, I had to tell it where, because if I'd told it in, you know, in chronological order, then I would have told immediately what Hobbes did.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, this has just been fascinating, and I think you can tell from our readers that they're going to want to read your other books and be looking forward to what you're coming out with in the future. I know I am. And this has been great. I've enjoyed it so much. I just wish we could have been in person today, Ann.
Oh, I know. It would have been fun.
We'll have you back again sometime.
That sounds good. That's wonderful.
Do it in person. I think that would be great. And I want to encourage our members to write me, as I've said, at carolyn@carolincurry.net. Or you can do it on the Women Alone Together email to let us know of some of the books you want to read. And look at the website for Lisa Wingate in November, and also Ron Greer, our pastoral counselor that always does a wonderful program for us right before the holidays. And he's going to be touching on the impact of COVID on our lives. And I've heard him do this presentation before, and it's very valuable. I'm looking forward to that. I think it'll be wonderful. And Ann, if you have nothing else to add, we will say goodbye.
It's been great, and I appreciate you having me.
Okay, we'll have you again sometime. Thank you so much. Everyone have a nice evening.
Bye.